In 1957, archaeologists in Iraq uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man who had lived, by their estimate, well into what would have been old age for his time. His right arm was withered, likely amputated or paralyzed years before his death. He was probably blind in one eye. He showed signs of hearing loss, and he had clearly survived for years after injuries that should have killed him almost immediately. Someone had been taking care of him. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why that single detail forced scientists to rewrite what they thought they knew about a species we once called brutish and simple. The skeleton became known as Shanidar 1, named after the cave in northern Iraq where it was discovered. Dating back roughly 45,000 years, the remains showed a devastating list of injuries. A crushing blow to the skull, likely suffered as a young man, severe enough that researchers believe it may have partially blinded him and affected the left side of his body permanently. A withered right arm, with evidence the lower portion had been amputated possibly decades before death. Degenerative damage to his legs and feet, consistent with a limp that would have made fast movement difficult, if not impossible. And significant hearing loss in both ears. Individually, any one of these injuries would have made hunting nearly impossible. Together, they should have been a death sentence within weeks. Instead, he lived for years. For decades, the dominant assumption about early human life was brutal simplicity, survival of the fittest, taken literally. If you couldn't keep up, couldn't hunt, couldn't contribute, you were left behind. This wasn't cruelty in this view. It was just the math of survival in a world with almost no margin for error. But when researchers looked closer at Shanidar 1's bones, something didn't add up. The healing patterns showed he lived for years, possibly a decade or more, after his most severe injuries. And here is where the story gets even more difficult to explain away. That kind of survival, with those specific disabilities, in that environment, is essentially impossible without sustained help from other people. Someone brought him food he couldn't gather himself every single day for years. Someone protected him during a period when he couldn't fully defend himself. And Shanidar 1 isn't an isolated case. At a site in Vietnam, archaeologists discovered the remains of a young man, likely paralyzed from the waist down since adolescence due to a degenerative disease, who lived for roughly a decade after his condition began. His condition would have made him completely unable to care for himself. He would have needed to be fed, moved, and cleaned daily for 10 years by people who gained nothing measurable from keeping him alive. In France, researchers examined remains showing severe dwarfism combined with other developmental abnormalities. The individual lived to adulthood in a community that had every biological incentive to abandon someone who could contribute little in the way of physical labor. So why would ancient human groups take on this burden? The answer challenges one of the most basic assumptions people make about prehistoric life. Some researchers argue this wasn't simply altruism in the way we think of it today. It may have been something closer to a survival strategy in itself. Groups that cared for injured or vulnerable members may have built stronger internal trust and cooperation, which paid off in situations where every member's cooperation genuinely mattered during a hunt, a conflict, or a harsh winter. Caring for the vulnerable wasn't a luxury early humans could barely afford. It may have been a behavior that helped hold the entire group together. There's another detail in the Shanidar case that adds a further layer to this, though it remains genuinely disputed among researchers. Around the remains of several Shanidar burials, scientists identified clusters of pollen, leading to a theory that the dead may have been buried with flowers, deliberately placed as part of a ritual. Some researchers argue the pollen could have entered the site through entirely natural means, such as burrowing rodents bringing in plant material long after burial. That debate hasn't been settled. But even setting the flower theory aside completely, the physical evidence of prolonged, hands-on care for a severely disabled individual stands entirely on its own. Neanderthals, a species long portrayed in popular culture as brutish and simple, were capable of sustained, long-term compassion towards someone who offered no clear biological advantage in return. Think about what this actually required, practically, day by day. Someone had to notice that Shanidar 1 needed help the very first time he was injured. Someone had to decide repeatedly over years that keeping him alive was worth the resources it cost the group. Someone had to carry food across the cave to him every day when he couldn't gather it himself. This wasn't a single act of kindness. It was a sustained commitment, maintained by multiple people, likely across an entire decade, in a world where every extra mouth to feed carried real risk for everyone else. So what does this mean beyond the archaeology itself? It means the story we often tell about early human life, that it was purely a ruthless competition where only the strongest survived, is incomplete. Alongside genuine hardship and danger, there is now consistent physical evidence that vulnerability didn't automatically mean abandonment. Compassion, in some form, appears to be nearly as old as our species itself, and possibly older since Shanidar one wasn't even Homo sapiens. He belonged to a species we drove to extinction and outlived by tens of thousands of years, and yet, in this one specific way, he lived inside a group no less capable of care than our own. The next time you picture early humans, don't only picture the hunt, or the fire, or the tools. Picture someone, tens of thousands of years ago, carrying food across a cave in the dark to a man who could no longer walk, because the group had decided again and again, for years, that he was still one of them.